When Russian President Vladimir Putin made the decision to invade Ukraine in 2022, he effectively cut his country off from large parts of the world. Western nations and many others immediately condemned the Kremlin's actions, imposed strict sanctions on Russian banks, businesses, and individuals, and severed ties with Moscow, not wanting to contribute in any way, shape, or form to the invasion. That left Russia and Putin with a smaller pool of potential allies and trade partners to turn to, and that pool has become even smaller as the war has continued. Now, realizing that Russia is running out of options, India and China, the two biggest countries that have continued buying Russian resources even as the war has progressed, have started to take advantage of the Kremlin's weakness. Bit by bit, these Asian nations are bleeding Russia dry, and there's not a single thing that Putin can do to stop them. Let's start with China, which is the world's second biggest economy and has consistently been the biggest buyer of Russian coal and crude oil over the course of the war so far. Trade between the two countries has also skyrocketed since 2022, and China has maintained a relatively neutral political stance regarding the war itself, with its leader Xi Jinping refusing to publicly condemn Putin for his aggression. Overall, despite the fact that China hasn't actually supplied Russia with any weapons or sent its own troops to assist in the invasion, Beijing has in large part helped to fund the war with Ukraine. As a result, Russia has become increasingly reliant on Chinese trade deals, resources, and investments. Without them, the Kremlin's economy would most likely fall apart, and the war would become utterly unsustainable, with Putin forced to either wave the white flag or take a seat at the negotiating table to discuss the terms of a peace deal. One Russian government source even admitted as much in a statement made to Reuters earlier this year. Without them, China, we would not have been able to make a single missile, let alone a drone, and the whole economy would have collapsed long ago. If they wanted it, the war would have been over long ago. China knows this. It understands exactly how powerful and influential its role is in the war, and it's taking full advantage. A recent report from the Bank of Finland's Institute for New Economies found that Chinese exporters have recently started hiking the prices of dual-use goods exported to Russia. The term dual-use goods covers any and all products, software, and technologies that have the potential to be used for both civilian and military purposes, like drones, for example, which could simply be used by civilians for recreational purposes or equipped with explosives and deployed in a battlefield setting. Encryption software, navigation systems, and certain kinds of chemicals also fall into the dual-use category, and China sends an enormous amount of these types of products to Russia on a regular basis. Indeed, a Carnegie Politica report from 2024 found that China was exporting more than $300 million worth of high-priority dual-use products to Russia. While that wasn't quite as high as the $600 million recorded in December 2023, it's still a massive figure, and China has by far been the biggest supplier of these sorts of products to Russia over the course of the conflict so far. In terms of specific products, the report goes on to note that many of the dual-use products Russia brings over its borders from China include technological components that are necessary for manufacturing weapons such as missiles, drones, and tanks, like machine tools, microelectronics, telecommunications equipment, radar, sensors, and optical drives, among other products. Russia does not have the infrastructure or capacity to make these kinds of items on its own, so it has to import them from somewhere, and there are very few nations that are able and willing to strike trade deals with Moscow these days. The report notes, for example, that in 2023, only Turkey, Malaysia, Armenia, and China were willing to provide more than 1% of Russia's high-priority imports. That puts China in an incredibly powerful position. Not only is it one of the only countries in the world capable of mass-producing the products that Russia needs, but it's also one of the only nations still willing to work with Moscow too. So, Chinese suppliers have made the logical business decision to raise their rates, with the Bank of Finland study finding that the average price paid by Russia for dual-use goods has risen by a whopping 87% between 2021 and 2024. For comparison's sake, average prices of similar goods shipped to nations that aren't Russia have increased by just 9%. So Russia is having to pay far, far more for the products it needs compared to every other country on Earth. As the authors of the study note, this confirms that Russia has managed to find ways to work around the effects of Western sanctions, turning to Asian nations to import the products it needs, but it has had to pay an increasingly high price in order to acquire these goods. Digging deeper into the data, the study authors also found that Russia has in fact had to scale down some of its purchases of certain products, like ball bearings, for example. The price of ball bearings reportedly rose by 76% in dollar terms between 2021 and 2024, while export volumes from China to Russia declined by 13% over that same period, showing how Russia was quite literally priced out of these products. A lot of this comes down to the impact of Western sanctions. Without those sanctions, Russia would have far more options when it comes to prospective trade partners. It could pick and choose which nations it wants to buy from, and countries wouldn't have the same fears and concerns about initiating trade with Moscow, paving the way for the Kremlin to buy up all the dual-use goods and other resources it requires to keep the war going or even intensify its aggression against Ukraine. Without sanctions, Russia would also find it much easier to import the relevant technologies and resources to manufacture its own dual-use products, so it wouldn't even necessarily need to turn to China at all. It could strengthen its domestic industries and make most of its essential products at home. Instead, thanks to the sanctions, Beijing holds all the cards, and Moscow is forced to pay its prices no matter how high they get. As the Financial Times notes, the study found that the impact of sanctions on prices appears to be increasing, possibly because stricter sanctions enforcement has allowed exporters to demand higher premiums from Russian clients. This is good news for Ukraine, for the many Western nations that have imposed wave after wave of sanctions on Russia and are now, at long last, beginning to see the results. It took time, as the initial waves simply weren't enough to dent the Russian economy, thanks to the Kremlin's clever planning and pre-war preparation. Now, however, sanctions are starting to damage Russia like never before, and in ways that many experts had never even anticipated. One high-ranking Western official involved with sanctions, for example, told reporters that the rip-off of the Russian military-industrial complex by Chinese companies has turned out to be a pretty good result for the West, adding, "If you raise the price of a product by 80%, you can essentially cut the amount they can buy in half." That's so important because if Russia continues to struggle to buy the resources it needs in sufficient quantities, it's going to find it harder and harder to keep this war going. Because this war is incredibly expensive, not just in terms of money itself, but also resources. Russia has suffered astonishing losses, with the latest figures from the Oryx open source intelligence analysis group listing over 4,200 tanks, more than 8,570 armored and infantry fighting vehicles, close to 700 armored personnel carriers, 411 infantry mobility vehicles, over 300 command posts and communication stations, and hundreds of artillery systems, rocket launchers, surface-to-air missile systems, and other assets all destroyed, with countless more damaged. Those assets all take huge amounts of money and resources to either repair or replace, and while Russia has managed to ramp up its domestic production capacities in certain areas, it's able to make large numbers of artillery without having to rely on external allies. For example, it still lacks the technology to produce those specific dual-use products that China specializes in, such as microelectronic and optical devices. Russia's chip-making capabilities, too, are literally decades behind China. So it's no surprise that Moscow's dependence on Beijing for high-priority products, including computer chips, semiconductors and sensors, rose from 32% back in 2021 to a staggering 89% by 2023. But despite relying more heavily on China than arguably at any prior point in its entire history, many in Russia still don't see Beijing as a true ally. Indeed, one source close to the Russian government recently revealed to Reuters, "China does not behave like an ally. Sometimes it lets us down and stops payments. Sometimes it takes advantage. Sometimes it's outright robbery. There is nothing allied about it." As Putin and his Kremlin cronies are starting to learn, this is the price you pay when you alienate and isolate yourselves from large parts of the global community. And China isn't the only one playing the price hike game. Researchers have also found that Turkey has also significantly increased the prices for Russian importers by averages of anywhere from 25 to 55% compared to similar exports to other nations. As if that wasn't bad enough, Russia's next biggest trade partner, India, appears increasingly reluctant to invest in the Kremlin's resources. So much so that Russia has recently started offering its crude oil to Indian refiners at record low prices in recent time, according to a Bloomberg report. The report revealed that Russia's flagship export, Urals crude oil, is being offered to India at a discount of up to $7 per barrel, according to anonymous sources familiar with the situation. This cut-rate price, the lowest in at least 2 years, applies to deliveries that are set to load in December and arrive in January, which suggests that Russian exporters are eager to encourage India to place orders rapidly in order to bring in some much-needed funds before 2025 comes to a close. Just like with China's price hikes, the reason behind this sudden steep discount for Indian importers all comes down to one simple thing: sanctions. The countries of the Western world have made Russia's oil industry one of their top priorities since the early stages of the war, since oil is, in many ways, the lifeblood of the Russian economy, accounting for around 30% of the country's entire federal budget. In December 2022, for example, G7 countries introduced a strict $60 price cap on Russian oil prices, but the Kremlin quickly found ways to work around these sanctions. It formed a so-called shadow fleet of tankers operating beyond the boundaries of Western insurance and shipping services, and by 2024, an estimated 60% of Russian crude oil was transported around the world on these shadow vessels, rendering the cap effectively meaningless. In response, NATO nations have been looking at other ways to damage the Russian oil industry more directly, and on October 22nd of this year, the US government took things to the next level, imposing some of its strictest sanctions yet on two of Russia's biggest oil producers, Rosneft and Lukoil. The impact of those sanctions has been swift and brutal, with Russia's own finance ministry figures showing that oil tax receipts for October fell by 27% compared to the previous year. It was an exceptionally shrewd move by the United States, as it sanctioned not only the companies themselves, but any nations found to have purchased their resources post the compliance deadline of November 21st. As a result, Indian refiners have swiftly started backing out of deals with Russian suppliers, fearing the threat of being excluded from the dollar-based financial system if they send even a single cent to Rosneft or Lukoil's accounts. Clearly worried about losing one of their most important investors, Russian exporters have resorted to the only option left, slashing their prices and hoping that the allure of cheap oil will prove sufficient to bring India's buyers back to the table. Some of them have indeed responded favorably to these new record low rates, but there's a catch. Indian refiners are only willing to deal with non-sanctioned Russian sellers, not Lukoil or Rosneft. The problem is that Lukoil, Rosneft and their subsidiaries provide around 80% of the oil that is being offered to New Delhi at this moment in time, leaving only a small fraction of oil left over that India is actually willing to buy. This shows how effective America's sanctions have been, as even nations with strong economies and powerful positions on the global stage, like India, are clearly concerned about the risks of deepening their ties with Russia. A US Treasury official confirmed as much on November 20th, telling Reuters that both Chinese and Indian banks and businesses are risk-averse, do recognize the importance of the relationships with the West, and are moving to comply. The Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control also reported on November 17th that analysis of market data proves that the October sanctions are having their intended effect of dampening Russian revenues by lowering the price of Russian oil and therefore the country's ability to fund its war effort against Ukraine. A spokesperson went on to add that the sanctions were effectively starving Putin's war machine and that the department is prepared to take further action if necessary to end the senseless killing in Ukraine. The statistics back this up. Urals crude has fallen by at least 21% since the October sanctions were announced, and Urals loaded at Russia's Novorossiysk port was trading at just $45.33 a barrel on November 12th, which is its lowest price since way back in March 2023. Additionally, before the sanctions hit, the discount on Urals crude to Indian refiners was significantly lower, at just $3 a barrel. With the new discount reaching $7, that means the size of the discount has more than doubled in just a single month. In the meantime, literally millions of barrels of Russian oil are effectively in limbo. According to recent market analysis, once the November 21st compliance deadline came and went, approximately 48 million barrels of Rosneft and Lukoil crude were simply stranded at sea, with no major nation willing to buy them. Both of the companies have also seen their values plummet, with shares in Lukoil dropping from 6,000 rubles $76.43 prior to the sanctions being announced to just 5,434 rubles $69.22 a few days later, a drop of just over 9%. Rosneft shares also fell off a cliff, declining from 402 rubles $5.12 to 374 rubles $4.76 in the same time frame. Lukoil has been forced to sell off most of its international assets to a Swiss commodity trader in the wake of the American sanctions, relinquishing control of most of its operations and assets beyond Russia's borders, including refineries in Bulgaria and Romania, oil and gas production facilities in Iraq and the United Arab Emirates, and gas station networks in the US and Europe too. In total, those assets are believed to be worth around $12 billion, but Lukoil is taking a big hit in the deal, according to Sergei Kaufman, an analyst at the Moscow-based brokerage firm FINA. It's impossible to sell such a broad range of assets without a discount, even if there was a preliminary agreement in place. We estimate the discount could be around 20 to 30%. Overall, the latest American sanctions have been some of the biggest and best yet, and their full effects will only be revealed as the days and weeks progress. Meanwhile, even though China and India remain Russia's biggest oil customers, there's every chance that either one or both of them may soon cut down on their investments in order to avoid falling victim to these sanctions as well. And America isn't the only one hitting the Kremlin's oil industry hard. Back in July, the EU published its own 18th package of sanctions against Russia, with large parts of that package focusing on the energy sector. The price cap on Russian oil was reduced to just $47.60 on September 3rd, for example, and the EU also introduced a new mechanism to adjust the oil price cap every 6 months, ensuring that it always remains at least 15% lower than the going market rate for Russian crude oil at any given time. In addition, starting on January 21, 2026, the EU is expanding its import ban relating to Russian crude oil and petroleum products. The Union will also prohibit any direct or indirect purchase, import, or transfer of petroleum products into the EU from non-EU countries using crude oil that originated in Russia. In other words, the EU is clamping down not just on Russian crude oil itself, but also on refined products like diesel, jet fuel, and kerosene made outside of Russia but using Russian resources. This should help to close the backdoor workarounds that Russia has relied upon to circumvent sanctions for so long, while making life even harder and far more expensive for the country's major oil companies throughout 2026 and beyond. The sanctions are growing and their effects are multiplying. And as Russia's oil economy grows weaker and poorer, so too does its war machine, leaving Putin's prospects looking increasingly grim. You can learn more about how another of the Kremlin's so-called allies has made the most of its relationship with Russia in this video, which looks at how North Korea has been selling useless, rotten ammo to Russian troops and pocketing the profits. Or for a deeper look at the latest waves of US sanctions and the effects they're likely to have on the war moving forward, watch this video. And if you don't want to miss out on more breaking news and in-depth analysis of the Russia-Ukraine war and other major military conflicts worldwide, make sure to subscribe to our channel today. And thank you, as always, for watching.